Charles Dickens uses a parable to talk about our journey through life. I discuss this and more on today's episode. Welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I've found in my travels. Today it is Short Story Tuesday, so I wanted to talk about a short story of interest, one from an author that I've talked about at least once on this channel before. And today's short story is all about life and parables of life. I am referring to The Child's Story by Charles Dickens, which was published around 1852. I talked about Charles Dickens on this channel before, so I don't need to go into that great of detail, but he was a writer in the 1800s who wrote a number of well-known stories like A Tale of Two Cities, A Christmas Story, David Copperfield, among many others, and he was well regarded for his work, celebrated around the world, or at least in Western culture. Although people do like his work, there's also a note that like his work was somewhat racist, unfortunately, so not ideal. But it's very important to talk about that racist as we talk about his work, so that's why I'm doing that here. But without further ado, let's talk about The Child's Story. I will do a summary, a little bit of analysis, and we will move on from there. So The Child's Story focuses on an unnamed traveler who the narrator says is going on a journey, a magical journey of some sort. And they're just walking through the world, and they stumble upon a child who is always playing. A beautiful child, which is a weird way to describe a child, but they end up playing, they use their imagination, they frolic through the world, and things seem to be very fun. However, one day the traveler loses that child, and they proceed to continue on their journey, and they stumble upon another boy who is always learning. And they go and learn new things about Greek and Roman gods and goddesses and various other things, supposedly reflecting the education of this young child. And once again, like eventually the traveler loses track of this boy, and he continues along his way. He eventually encounters a young man who loves, and that young man develops a couple different relationships, but especially forming a relationship with a young lady named Fanny, which is important because Fanny was the name of Charles Dickens' sister, so I guess she's included in this story, and they seem to be happy together. But eventually, the traveler loses track of this couple, and they once again continue on their way. They eventually find a gentleman who is always busy, and that gentleman seems to have a wife and children, including at least one that unfortunately dies, that gentleman is always busy, again, dealing with various aspects of life, raising their children before their children eventually leave the home. And the wife sees like one of her dead children in the distance and goes on to meet them and says that she's in heaven now. And so the gentleman eventually, like the traveler eventually loses track of the gentleman, and then again continues on and finds an old man who is always remembering, the traveler remembers with the old man of the great things that once happened, and as the story comes to a close, the narrator notes that this traveler is grandfather, because what the grandfather is doing is what is happening to them, but what also they do to their grandfather. I think that it might be like Charles Dickens kind of breaking the fourth wall there or something like that, but that seems to be what's happening here, and that's where the story ends. In terms of analysis, there is a fair bit to talk about with this story. One of the themes that Charles Dickens is working with is that of life. So he's really just characterizing the story of life. using these distinct periods. And so you see those distinct periods such as play, periods of learning or education, periods of work, periods of family, and periods of remembering what your life once was. I think what Dickens is saying is that these are the periods of your life where you're allowed to play, but you have to eventually grow up and get a job and start a family and all of that. But it's interesting because eventually you move on from those periods and you move into other periods where there doesn't seem to be an aspect of the before periods there. So my question is Dickens saying that there are moments of forgetting in your life where you forget how to play, or you no longer need to learn because you've already done that, or once your children grow up, your busy life is officially over. I don't really know what Dickens is trying to say there. I welcome you to, comment below and let me know what you think. I certainly think that Dickens might be saying that there are moments of forgetting that you're no longer the person you once were, and so you're no longer just focused on playing or just focused on learning. You're doing other things, and that's kind of sad, because if you lose that part of yourself where you're able to play, and maybe that just might be the time period that Dickens was living in, it does feel like you lose certain aspects of yourself. But again, that might be exactly what Dickens is trying to say. And I should note that this story was written later in Dickens' own life, like 18 years from this point he would be dead, and that's. Maybe this is him sort of reflecting on where he was in his life. He was around 40, I think, at the time this was written. So maybe at a point where he could reflect, and life expectancies weren't very long back then. So maybe he was just reflecting on what he thought was like a near end point of his life. It's certainly something worth considering. You might think of this story differently if it was written in Dickens's 20s. And similar to life, Charles Dickens is also writing about death here. Dickens represents death in multiple ways throughout the story. You can see it with the setting sun, how it's bright in the sky, but near the end of the life, it's setting. It's which you typically associate with death. So the grandfather is sort of recalling things, or the man at the end of the story is recalling things as the sun is entering the twilight of his life, and then you also see death represented in being called, with the mother being called by her children as she's at a point where she's going to die, and so the death is represented by dead family members calling you from the beyond so that it is your turn to be in the great beyond. And then you also see this represented in how the forest changes over the story, with the leaves entering the autumn period, which is a sort of analogy for death in this case, because once the leaves fall off, the trees are dead and they won't reawaken until spring or something like that. But you also see death represented at certain periods of life. As I mentioned before, those moments of forgetting seem to be the death of those moments in life. Again, a question of whether Dickens believes that you kind of lose those aspects of yourself, or if it's simply like you're moving on to the next stage and you retain some elements of those previous life. That's a bit unclear, but it does feel like a certain kind of death here. And the last thing worth noting is that this story is a parable, or perhaps an allegory. It's not written with specific characters in mind, but rather it's supposed to represent the various stages of life and the changes that you experience in life as you go from one period to another. So a very interesting kind of way of sort of showing how the story is, or how your life is going to go. You utilizing like traveling down a path and that's in a forest, and encountering yourself at various stages. and then remembering it once you reach the late stages of your life. Very interesting means of telling a story, as I said before. I feel like without the quality of writing that Dickens is doing here, it might not be as memorable, or it might not be as interesting to read. Anyway, those are my thoughts on The Child's Story by Charles Dickens, a fun short story, if a bit brief. I don't think there's a way that you could have elongated it without ruining the sort of means of which you're telling it. It might be short, but it's still worth reading just to get more Charles Dickens in your life. If you have any thoughts on it, let me know in the comments below. I would love to hear from you and have a conversation about this writing. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about Dickens if they don't know already, as well as this short story. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and life-traveling travels. Farewell.